And welcome to Seton for everyone else. See, there's a Board of Governors member here, and we thank you for coming. And we have some people from various disciplines, which is wonderful. I'm Gayle MacDonald. I'm the Associate Vice President Research here at Mount St. Vincent University. And I was supposed to be chairing and helping with Q&A, and I've had an injury to my leg, and so I can't stay. But I'm really sorry I can't stay because this looks like a very rich discussion. But I did take the liberty of making a few notes just to, aggravate the speakers. No, just to just to get the discussion going a bit, perhaps. So from my right, Dr. Susie Brigham from the Faculty of Education, Dr. Amelie Lemieux from also the Faculty of Education, and our own Ashwani Kumar. So we're very happy to have these three speakers, and we're waiting for one, Hart Stoffman, who is a public school teacher from the Halifax Regional Center of Education. So we'll embarrass him when he comes in late. How's that? That's what I usually do. So we're here to celebrate Dr. Kumar's book, Curriculum in International Contexts, Understanding Colonial, Ideological, and Neoliberal Influences. It's a very lovely book. You'll have to come up and look at it and ask where you can get a copy afterwards. So I wish to speak briefly to the three tenets of Ashwani's title, the colonial, ideological, and neoliberal influences on curriculum through a singular lens, the upsurgence of mindfulness in pedagogical circles. David Forbes, in his 2019 book, Mindfulness and Its Discontents, Education, Self, and Social Transformation, which I'm currently reading, does a healthy critique of the overuse and misunderstanding of mindfulness pedagogy in this age of individualism and overtly focused self as a category of being. Forbes reminds us of the sanitization and neoliberalist agenda of mindfulness in the West, divorced of the rich tradition from which it comes in India, China, and Tibet. We are to be reminded that simple meditation, simple mindfulness comes from a depth of rich text and tradition that cannot be reduced to memes, to emojis, or to enrichment of self as a goal. The understanding of enlightenment, for most, is a goal that always ends up in service to the greater, wider community. It is selflessness at its best. So rather than elevate the self, which mindfulness purports to do, it is a complete understanding of the self, the good, the bad, the ugly, the vicious, and a complete acceptance of the humane in the service of wider humanity, in the service of generations yet to come. That is what works best. Critique of ideological posturing, which I'm sure Ashwani has done in this book, is the most useful way to think about the transformation any aspect of pedagogy undergoes. Indigenous scholars know this only too well, what colonialism has wrought on the academy. The othering, the non-self, the repeated undermining of what it is to be differently human in curriculum that is not situated, that is contextual and ahistorical, is simply ignorant. To be truly a curriculum for the world, I would argue, as I'm sure all these panelists will, is to know each other. To know each other's culture, context, situation, and the complexities of all. To do so is to know the simplicity behind this, that to be human is a simple matter. It is about what we share rather than what divides. I wish you a fine panel and some really good discussion. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much for your remarks. I just recently reviewed a doctoral dissertation focused on mindfulness, and those were the issues in that dissertation, that it was a quick fix of psychological and relational problems rather than developing a deeper understanding of the self. And because mindfulness is proposed as a kind of a trick, kind of a way, so that you can be more concentrated, so that you can have less stress and work more, therefore it becomes part of capitalist and neoliberal logic very easily.
It's the John Cabot-Zinness of mindfulness that's the problem, I think. And it's exactly that. I like your phrase, meditative inquiry, because that gets at questioning and what meditation can truly offer to the classroom, to pedagogy. Because studied in the absence of the traditions from which it comes, I would argue, is a complete and utter fallacy. It feeds into the liberalism and the individualism that is currently predominant in the West. That we're all about ourselves and only ourselves. The March Tomorrow on climate change is a full testament to how we are united in many, many things on this planet rather than divided. So it divides us further. It doesn't mean one doesn't work on oneself, but for what purpose? For what purpose? Thanks very much.
I'm going to provide you a brief overview of what the book is about and what are the central ideas that I'm trying to convey. But before that, I would like to thank all of you, those who have been able to come, particularly Mount St. Vincent University's internal grant that made this event possible. Thanks so much to Dean of Education, Anthony Card, who also supported this event generously, to the panelists, to all the friends, and all the students and colleagues who could come. If I miss somebody, I apologize. So these are the key goals of key points that I want to cover. I want to discuss the goals of this book and my journey starting in India as a student of geography honors to here, teaching now here, how it has developed, and through that, how have I come upon this book, because it's not a book that is disconnected from my life history. That's what I learned from my supervisor, William Piner, very famous educator, and I dedicated this book to him, and also to one of my professors in India, K.K. Majumdar, who was very instrumental in shaping the way I think and the way I teach. I would cover my journey, and I would like to discuss what are the three influences, three deleterious or negative influences on curriculum that we see in the world, not only in Canada, but in other parts of the world as well. And 4 responses that we can offer: indigenous, critical, autobiographical, and meditative. And then a brief summary of the chapters. So basically what I have done in this book is I would like to tell you the story first, and then you will understand what is the content of this book. The title of the book is Curriculum in International Contexts. So the word international is very relevant here. And when I was writing the introduction to this book, I was thinking, when was the first time when I became interested in this word? When I began to think in a manner that is international in nature. And then I was reminded of my training in geography, because my first few degrees are in the discipline of geography. And I remembered, and I remembered that my first introduction to the connectedness of the globe, to the unity of life forms, to the unity in diversity of life forms around the world, is a central tenet of geography. But at the same time, you also see that those principles and perspectives that call for unification or unity were quite underemphasized, and that underemphasis reflected itself in intensifying nationalisms and also colonialism and imperialism. That rather than that forced us, or that conditioned people to look at the world as divided fragments rather than a unified whole. So that was my first introduction to what international means, to what it means to be a citizen of this earth, to what it means to be living together and working together and transforming the world in a way that is productive and sustainable for all of us. And what's happening in the recent days, the problems that are going on with reference to climate change and all, it's an indicator that the way we treated the earth and the way we divided it up, and the way it's all about my profit and my group's profit and my country's profit, how those divisions have become intense and intense and intense, that we are at the verge that we can endanger life on earth. But our self-centeredness, which can glorify itself as nationalism, continues to happen. It still continues to exert its influence. So that was my first introduction. And then I moved to the discipline of education. Long story, I won't bore you with that. But I moved from geography to education. And in education, I'm just going to the next slide, because that would be easier. Before I moved to education, one thing also that became very prominent in my life, and I have tried to explain in my autobiographical pieces, in my first book and in other papers, that how study of consciousness, which is the primary focus of my teaching and learning as a teacher educator, how studying yourself, how understanding yourself became the focus for me as a human being, and then how it became a very important part of the research that I did as a master's student and as a doctoral student. There are so many things to cover, but I want not to take too much time so that others can share their viewpoint as well. So, and when I went to the Faculty of Education to do my BEd and MEd, at my master's level, I conceptualized a notion of global citizenship, where you can bring the two together. Because most often we see that the citizenship, or the purpose of good education, is generally focused on changing the society, changing the outward oppressive structure, which is very important. But the more I studied the nature of human consciousness, and the more I studied myself, the more I realized that the structures are a manifestation of how we think, how we feel, and how we relate with each other. Through those kinds of subtle psychological, deeply cultural and unconscious interactions that we create outward, gross structures that we see. And when we try to change them explicitly, we pervert them rather than actually change them. You can take the issue of racism. We try to solve racism generally through law and litigation. But it's not just a legal problem. It's not just a social problem. It is also a deeply psychological problem. That's why it continued to persist. That's why it continued to exert its influence. So unless one understands the psychological root of the problem, it is very difficult to make a change at the external level. So unless one changes deeply inwardly, it's difficult to change the outward structures. That was the thing that I emphasized in my master's thesis, which I further explored in my doctoral education. Welcome, Hart. Here, your seat is here.
So much for walking in unannounced.
Thank you so much. So when I went to my doctoral program, I worked on an idea. It's called curriculum as meditative inquiry. Basically, essentially what it focused on, that studying yourself in relation to others. So studying yourself not as a self-centered activity, studying yourself so that you feel calm and then you can become more productive and more stressful, but studying in yourself in a deeper sense, in a deeper way, creating a deeper connection within yourself and a deeper connection with other human beings. So that through this relational connection, we create a society in which there is a place for understanding and not just dependent on outer rigid structures through which we control our behavior. Because generally it never works. It only works at superficial level. So that was the focus of my doctoral thesis. The reason I'm telling you is that all this historical evolution of my academic, intellectual, and existential life has resulted into the book. There, my doctoral supervisor, as I mentioned, was William Pienaar. I studied with him, and there I also worked as his research assistant. And as part of his research assistant, I worked on a project which he calls internationalization of curriculum studies. the basic focus of that project was that scholars from South Africa, Brazil, and Mexico, he has another project on China and India too, but I was involved with the first project, where they will talk about what they were doing in their country, what the status of education is, what the status of curriculum and teaching is, what challenges are they facing, what difficulties are they facing, and then creating an interaction between them. My work was to read their original pieces and commentaries on their original pieces by Dr. Kumar, not Dr. Kumar, Dr. Painar, and a panel of international scholars, and read them all and kind of try to give a synoptic view of what curriculum studies, teaching, learning look like in these contexts. So 3 of the chapters in this book, curriculum studies in South Africa, Brazil, and Mexico, these 3 chapters are based on my work with him and then my own research on the subject matter later on. Another individual who I met there is, his name is E. Van Ross, again very known and critically acclaimed social studies educator, and who has deep interest in understanding the neoliberalism and its impact on education and other aspects of our life. With him, I also became very interested in understanding the importance of critical pedagogy and understanding how principles like neoliberalism and capitalism and their focus on competition, measurement, and comparison makes education something very superficial. And essentially, in the name of education, we are trying to give anti-education. It's anti-educational. Focus on testing, focus on comparison, focus on sorting as if they are different grades of pipes rather than living human beings who need to grow, who need to understand. So, and my work with him resulted in other chapters of the book. One chapter on neoliberalism, the other chapter is on how can we understand social studies and citizenship education from postmodern lens. And there is another chapter in this book where I survey, where I study survey of citizenship education in Asia, and what appears from that nationalism and ideological control of teaching is very prominent in Asia. Very prominent, explicit, but subtly it operates everywhere. The ideological control of teaching. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And then all this background, and for the past 8 years, I've also been teaching here at the Mount. And through interaction with students and through my own research, I have developed this pedagogical concept you can call teaching as meditative inquiry, which I explored with a student of mine in a paper. And this, it was very challenging in the beginning because I was trying new things, I was experimenting with new ideas, but many of my graduate students, Hart is here, Bonnie is there, were supportive of the kinds of ideas that I was trying to experiment with in the classroom. So those 8 years of experimentation, and a lot of B.Ed students are here who are taking holistic education with me. What you are seeing in the class that is happening is an approach to teaching that I have developed over the past 8 years. And recently, that paper was recognized as an outstanding publication by Canadian Association of Curriculum Studies. That only gives me relief that not only it's between me and the students that this pedagogy has some potential, but the wider scholarly community also sees value in it. One key thing that I emphasize in this book based on my study of this context, that curriculum is not neutral. In most places, in most locales, the way curriculum is proposed, it proposed as something neutral, something that is going to lead to the so-called progress. I don't know progress to what, because so far whatever the progress that we are making doesn't look like progress in the bigger picture. And that's what we seeing what was happening in rainforest few weeks ago. Amazon rainforest and what's happening now in the form of protest against climate change. That curriculum it's not a neutral thing, it's not something, it's undergirded by a lot of influences. Now, I think I was speaking in one of the classes, I don't remember which classes, but I was trying to explain, not to become cynical, but just to understand that education is such an activity which has been very seriously controlled by lot of influences, but definitely by the ideology of the government, or the ideology of the elites, or the ideology of the powerful people. So unfortunately, that's why education in all contexts generally have become very provincial or very centered. I had Eve and Ross as a speaker in my class last night through Blackboard Collaborate, and he was saying that teacher education programs operate in such a way, and there is a reason for it, as if the purpose of teachers is only to teach in that province and according to the guidelines of that province. So see, here itself you see it's a major control on what teaching is, what learning is, how it should be done. But it comes in such a subtle manner that we don't even realize it. And that's going on around the world. I wasn't aware. It's very deeply rooted in India and all other countries, because government has stake in education. Again, I'm not trying to be cynical or criticizing. I'm just stating the facts that are there, that government has a strong control on education. And part of teacher education is to make students aware of that, because generally teacher education is perceived as preparing teacher to fit in a particular context. To me, that's a very narrow view of education, because that context is also constantly changing as the politics of that context is changing. So the focus of, so this is like the ideological control on teaching and curriculum. And what I try to emphasize, and what majority of the students seem to understand, that the purpose of becoming a teacher or becoming an educator should be broader purpose, not necessarily just teaching you a discipline in a particular context, but teaching, but educating in the broadest sense of the term, which means that you have to be aware of not just one predominant model of what teaching and learning is, but a variety of models that have been explored throughout the world. That's why the focus on holistic education, so that you don't only learn what's happening in your particular context, but that you're also aware of a wider variety of pedagogical and curricular approaches, which may be very different. That is one influence that I noted. The second influence that I noted, particularly in South Africa and India and in many other parts of the world, in Mexico and Brazil, it appears as more as imperial influence of US in their US and World Bank and IMF, in the educational policies of countries like Mexico and Brazil. I'm not going to burden you too much with the detail, but the basic thing that I'm trying to convey is that when colonialism happens, or when one group of individuals, one group controls the other group, generally what it results it is in stripping off their own culture, their own education, their own way of pedagogy. Now, more and more as we are learning about indigenous education, we are realizing that they were the pioneers of holistic and alternative educational practices, where the relationship was emphasized, where self-learning was emphasized, where connection with the creator or the connection with life was emphasized. But those views became less and less significant as colonial or the people or the powerful views became more and more prominent. So this is also one of the factors that I noticed very prominent in majority of the world. Either it is the colonial forces or it is the imperial forces which suppress indigenous knowledges. That happened in India too during British rule. A lot of the indigenous knowledges were suppressed, but there is also a revival, as it is in Canada. I think you must have heard this word neoliberalism so many times. I'm not the only one who is talking about it. But basically, what is the focus of neoliberalism is everything is a commodity. including education. Everything is a commodity, including meditation. Whatever can be sold and purchased should be sold and purchased freely. Government should have less and less interference in including welfare activities, including education, and in states it's very apparent. Neoliberal forces are very prominent. I think they are becoming prominent in Canada too, with a lot of emphasis on outcomes-based education, a lot of emphasis on standardized testing, and lot of emphasis on comparing schools with each other, comparing students with each other. These are all very deeply neoliberal and capitalist ideas where education is not the development of your whole being, but education is a way to get ahead in the society. That is its primary focus. So employability, efficiency, all these buzzwords are used in order to suppress the creative and the intelligent and the meditative potential of human beings. Based on my studies so far, and paying attention to the literature, I thought of the 4 responses that I think could help us, and I try to include all of these 4 responses and many other responses in my classrooms so that students are aware of the colonial, ideological, and neoliberal influences on their teaching, on their curriculum, and they can challenge them. In Canada, I think it is becoming very prominent now, which is very important. Indigenous response. I just explained a few minutes ago that Indigenous focuses on connections, on the well-being of the child, not only the academic well-being, but the emotional well-being, but the spiritual well-being, the holistic well-being. That is one of the response that when we are teaching as teachers in our classroom, we shouldn't just emphasize one part. We should provide space so that other parts can grow. The other response is critical response that we are trying to do here, which essentially means that realizing, as I said before, that curriculum is not a neutral guideline. It represents the voice of the powerful. It also represents the voice of the market. So such a critical look at the text that you're teaching your students and at the curriculum that you're following, unless you have that critical look, you will be more of installers of curriculum, as Ted Oki says, rather than creators and co-creators of curriculum with your students. Another factor is response is autobiographical response. I mentioned Will Piner and Madeleine Grumet and many other scholars have contributed really immensely to this response, which essentially means that this world is composed of individual subjectivities interacting with each other. So the importance of subjectivity and subjective experience, not only what you want to teach the child, but also understanding from where do you want to teach the child. What is your subjective perspective? And what is the subjective experiential perspective of the child? So the curriculum shouldn't become as dominant that it crushes your subjective beings and the teaching becomes an automatonous activity, a robotic activity, but something that is living in existential, which can only happen if we create a connection, establish a connection with ourselves. Meditative response. You could say the essence of meditative inquiry approach that I've been trying to develop and I've been trying to explore. Essentially what it means is that there is a life inside of you, and when we do in class, when we try meditation exercises and other reflective exercises, we see that there are a lot of fears, a lot of unresolved questions, a lot of feelings of anxiety, not only in you but also in your students and society in general. And if we think that we can live healthily and happily and creatively without paying attention to ourselves and also encouraging our students to pay attention to ourselves, in my view, and I may be wrong, we have a very narrow vision of education. It's a very superficial, unless the education is rooted within you, unless it allows your creative and meditative potential to flower, your intelligence to flower, it's a very narrow and meaningless education. And in the long run, it only creates psychological, relational, and as we are seeing, global crisis. I think thank you. That's it for me. I prepare PowerPoints keeping in mind that it's for students, but I'm really bad at following them because I think they disrupt my flow. So I will send it to you if you would like to have a look at. So if Amelie can go next, followed by Susie and then Hart, is that good? And I apologize if I took longer than I should have.
Okay, 1, 2, hello. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel. I think we're very fortunate at the Mount to have such amazing professors. You know, you have Ashwani, you have Susie, and, you know, leadership such as Dean Card, who's in attendance tonight. So we're very fortunate. And I really liked going through this book. And what I'll be talking about today specifically is chapter 7 about postmodernism and how postmodernism shaped curriculum theory. I think the book is very clearly written, and Ashwani really masters the concept that he's talking about. So it's a good reference, I find, to go back to this book. So if I look, say, page 203, one of the goals of postmodernism that really captured me was as follows. The goal of postmodernist social studies education should be to examine, understand, and reveal the deeper meanings, structures, and processes that underpin social, historical, political, economic knowledges, processes, and institutions. Without such a profound engagement and exploration, social studies will continue to be atheoretical, apolitical, and ahistorical in nature, and remain a victim of positivistic, behavioralistic, outcomes-oriented, and instrumental approaches to research and teaching. So in my work here at the Mount, I teach literacy and technology education with a focus on these types of issues. And for those of you present and in attendance who took my course, you all know about this. But we're going to talk about that a bit deeper, okay? So today what I want to do briefly is to present a brief survey of the landscape of posthumanist research as it relates to curriculum and literacy research by retracing and reminiscing the tenets of the theories of the 60s by people like Barthes and Derrida. I explain how the focus has shifted from the author and the human to the learner and the relationality between things, and how we are right now entering the third decade of the 21st century. We're shifting our focus from the centrality of the role of the human, but thinking also about non-human and more than human. So the indigenous response that Ashwani talked about is really linked to those concepts as well. Okay. So again in the book, page 198, we see what is therefore important is not to develop universal truths about human thinking, feelings, actions, interactions, and events, but to understand the context and situations, political, economic, historical, cultural, aesthetic, literary, and psychological, in and through which they occur. And so building on these parameters and vectors helps us understand the conditions of teaching and learning as a whole and in different contexts today. So what does that mean for, say, technology and literacy education? Okay. Taking this a step further, postmodernism solicits diverse perspectives that are needed and important, and that seek to counter objective truths about science and research. And posthumanism, informed by my work with Jennifer Rousel, decenters humans and their subjectivities to account for non-human and more than human knowledge. Okay. Recommended readings on these topics that build to some extent on postmodernism are the work of Rosie Braidotti on postmodern feminism, Prama Nayar in the learning sciences, Donna Haraway on the cyborg and feminism, Jessica Ringrose, who's at UCL, who talks about sexual education in relation to postmodernism, posthumanism, and Jennifer Rousel, who will be joining us November 29 for a conference on this topic. So part of the idea with this is to think beyond disciplinary silos that have been imposed on us for a very, very long time. Okay, this kind of thinking happened with a lot of French philosophers in the 1960s. Okay, so think about people like Roland Barthes, think about Foucault, think about Jacques Derrida, Lyotard as well. And all of these people really wanted to disrupt those notions in the turn to postmodernism and think about deconstructing what is given. Okay, so people like Lyotard wrote The Postmodern Condition in 1979, originally written in French on that year, and then later on translated into English. And I'm going to say a word about translations because we see a lot of popularity about, say, the use of Deleuze and Guattari in social sciences, and nobody talks about who translates them. And I feel like we should do a very good critical response and critical outlook of how language still plays a role in understanding big concepts that shifts a lot of ideas in the social sciences and humanities. So that's a small parenthesis. Then we have, someone like Jacques Derrida, who talked about deconstruction and literacy studies and philosophy, more specifically. He's maybe one of the most famous people or faces of postmodernism and post-structuralism, with more than 40 books. And his understanding was that there's truth in the opposite of the given. And there's always truth in the opposite about an idea that predominates. Okay, so I see we can already make links with what Ashwani just covered a couple of minutes ago. Things are seen as abilities, okay, that can be deconstructed. So, for example, there's high, but there's also low culture. Visual predominates over touch. But all counterparts should be loved and considered equally. Okay. Derrida also talked about states of confusion and doubt. Okay. He called that aporia. Okay, which brings me back to the idea of meditation that Ashwani talks about, because meditation brings us to a state of it's okay not to be okay and consider all of these kinds of elements in a peaceful way. But Derrida was saying exactly that those states of aporia brings us to deeper knowledge, and we shouldn't just, follow those banking models of education that Freire talks about, right? And we should go beyond, and this is where we learn the most. And he says to drive away from logocentrism, which is the truth and naive devotion to logic and language as best ways to communicate. So in technology education, we know that we're far beyond that, yet some areas of our curriculum entirely disregard the role of technology in education right now, and as we enter the third decade of the 21st century. And I'm not trying to romanticize technology, but just trying to bring awareness about the ways that we can work with it as a given right now, and to try to see the truth, but also what can be found in the opposite of the truth. And then, of course, and famously, we had Roland Barthes with The Death of the Author, who brought about the birth of the reader and how interpretations were shaped. That was the postmodern condition, I would say, in a nutshell. Moving from postmodernism to posthumanism, which is an area or emphasis of the things that I'm studying right now. we have people like, again, Pramod Nayar that I brought here, who talks about transhumanism or posthumanism. And he says that technology fills the gap in humans, basically. And one thing that is very close to Ashwani's critical indigenous response would be critical posthumanism as ways that favor symbiosis and dynamic hybrids when we think about thinking and think with thinking. Okay. Two other things that I brought here. One of my favorites, Donna Haraway, When Species Meet. Okay, so she's one of the most famous feminist writers that wrote about posthumanism. And if you're interested in that, she talks about the relational and the more than relational. Just basically decentering the human and saying how, education should move away from just centering people, but considering the whole environment and stopping the privilege of human over, say, animals, right? So she wrote this book about basically the relationship between humans and dogs and how dogs actually are very, very take precedence even and condition the ways humans react to those kinds of species. And that brings me to my third emphasis, which is linked to people who had my classes know that I bring a lot of books, so I hope it's informative. So finally, what this means for education right now in technology and literacy education is that we go beyond best practices, okay? Because technology is messy and it doesn't always work. So taking that into account in research is actually really, really important, and moving from neoliberalism and moving from best practices and businesses who say that, if you use such and such thing, you're going to become a better learner. Well, it's just more complex than that. And so thinking about entanglements, and I will stop on this note, I leave you with this. We need to consider how the entanglements of children, teachers, paper, computers, printers, web pages, paints, policies, desks, crayons, assessments, languages, genders, abilities, and so forth all matter literally in literacies, coming to be and in students coming to be composers and writers. Okay? So while products do matter, and literally they matter, so do the processes of people and materials working together. There is a mutually constitutive relationship between people and materials, and this is from Candace Kubi, who's at the University of Missouri, and she talks about that in relation to literacies and technology, education, and early childhood. So it's not just to consider the human, but everything that actually is not the human, and how all of these actors play an equal part in constituting what education is in neoliberal times. Thank you.
Good evening. It's lovely to see you all. And nice to see my students, some of my students here, and my fellow Board of Governors sister over there. So it's really great to have you all together. And thank you so much, Ashwani, for inviting me to be a panelist. And congratulations on this book, and I do recommend it. I think it'll be a very useful resource for myself as well. And as I read through, there were so many things that kept coming back to me that really resonated with me. And in the sense of being an educator myself, a teacher, someone who used to work for the World Bank, someone who also has lived in other countries and taught in many different cultures. So it certainly resonated with me, and I feel like there's a lot of value in this book. And so at the very beginning of the book, Ashwani says, "It opened my mind to the world of concepts, insights, and perceptions, which allowed me to study and understand how human beings across the globe have come to relate with and connect with nature, and how this interaction has brought about a diverse, unique, and rich cultural heritage around the globe." So what is he talking about? he is and I'll read it again because I find this a very useful concept for thinking of education as a broad understanding. He says, "It opened my mind to the world of concepts, insights, and perceptions, which allowed me to study and understand how human beings across the globe have come to relate with and connect with nature, and how this interaction has brought about a diverse, unique, and rich cultural heritage around the globe." And actually what Ashwani was talking about was geography. It's one of his great loves. But I find that the way you describe geography is really, I'd say, the essence of what education really ought to be. It ought to be about understanding different concepts and perceptions. It ought to be about connecting with nature and about understanding diverse and unique cultures and heritages. But I do feel, and some of you may also agree with me on that, that I don't see that necessarily in education in many contexts, in the context where I've taught. So essentially what Ashwani is addressing in this book is about the power of curriculum and the power that's invested in curriculum. And he's defining curriculum very broadly. It's a concept, it's a document, and it's a lived experience. And he adds that the everyday life research focus, curriculum is an official document which becomes curriculum as lived experiences, influenced by action and power networks of the school's everyday life. The power networks, with their threads of power, their Deleuzian knots, and their lines of flight, are not only discernible in daily life, but extend beyond it and reach to where the participants live. So he's drawing our attention to the fact that curriculum is controlled and it is shaped by several forces, and particularly culture within which it is situated, the political and the religious ideologies, and the sway of the market, as he mentioned, and of the teachers who interpret it and engage with it. But I would add, Ashwani, the learners. I would say that it's also how the learners engage with it, how they resist it, how they thwart it, how they challenge it, how they defy it, how they are also challenged by it. So without the learners, there really is no curriculum. So has someone, myself, being interested in Afrocentricity, feminism, critical theory, and anti-colonialism, these are aspects, but also theoretical perspectives that I've been exploring over the years. I really did find some resonance with Ashwani's points. So as we are all aware, in Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has reinforced this call for action in raising awareness of the ways in which curriculum writ large has resulted in epistemic violence, and I would say also ontological violence, in the ways in which curriculum and colonizers have used the curriculum through government, through church, through educational policies. They've actively and physically and ideologically used curriculum to subjugate, to control, to dominate, and to repress Indigenous populations and Indigenous knowledges. So what is stimulating about Ashwani's take on education is his four perspectives, which he had up here on the slide: the Indigenous, the critical, the autobiographical, and the meditative perspectives. So I would say the combination of these perspectives is, it lifts the veil and it shines the light on a unique way of looking at the ideological, colonial, and neoliberal influences on curriculum. And I saw something on Facebook this morning, maybe you saw it too, but it was actually a quote by Krishnamurti. And it says, "It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a sick society." And I reckon there's some truth in that, and I think that's really what Ashwani is trying to get at. So again, there's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a sick society. So I would suggest that this is the essential understanding that Ashwani is exploring in his book. So he's talking about a geography of peace, and he offers a take on education in which spirituality and meditation are explored. And that's where I remember when Ashwani did a book launch of his first book, and I remember kind of being intrigued, but also kind of a bit dubious at one point. How can we be focused so much on the individual when we really ought to be looking at social structures? So I did query that last time we were together in a setting like this. And I realized too that what Ashwani is saying, that we need to recognize that while we, of course, have to be critically conscious of social structures in society, we also have to be we have to have a critical self-understanding. And that's what he was talking about earlier, about this meditative inquiry. And that puts me in mind of the words of Marcus Garvey, who you're probably familiar with, when he proposed the Back to Africa movement. And he says, emancipate your mind from mental slavery, because whilst others might free the body, none but ourselves can free our minds. And Garvey and his supporters referred to that movement as the African Redemption, and it became the Redemption song by Bob Marley. But it takes hard work to be engaged in counter-hegemonic practice. It's hard for us to ask questions when we don't even know what we need to be asking about. And that's the power of hegemony. So in an article that Ashwani published in June, it's not in the book, but it's an article I would recommend, he talks about improvisation. It's going where your heart wants to go. Flow with the melody without rules and don't get stuck in a box. Learning is neither sequential or linear. Follow your intuition. And he says you can learn hard things before you learn easy things. And he adds, one has to make sure that one maintains one's originality and independence. However well-intentioned external pressures, standards, and expectations can force you to do what is not in tune with your own well-being and your own way of being. One must make sure one's inner flow is not suppressed by outer pressures and that one follows one's own path. And it's really about living intelligently, and that's without succumbing to those external pressures, those rules and structures. And it's by trusting your own creative and intuitive capacities. And you will know how to use those rules that are imposed on you by the social structures, including by schools. So this may not be a particularly new idea. I think it's been around for quite some time. African peoples, indigenous peoples have been asserting this for generations. And they're asserting it even despite the years and years of oppressions that they have experienced. This idea of trusting your intuition, and that's why I appreciate Ashwani's focus on meditative inquiry, as well as this idea of spirituality. Often when we talk about education, no one talks about spirituality, but I think it's a critical aspect of what we do in education. And so chapter 2 of his book, he focuses on South Africa, and having a connection to that context, I focus my attention on it. And he's raising some historical analysis about the way that curriculum has been developed in that country and how the curriculum has been used really to repress through a colonial process and through the role of the churches, and not only that, but of course the apartheid process. And so the clear underlying message of the apartheid process was that some people are naturally superior to others, and that some people are deemed sufficiently human enough to be considered citizens and others have not. And that system lived way too long. I don't even know how it was allowed to live in the world, an apartheid system. But there is evidence of that all around in other contexts as well, in colonial settings. And so the idea that the indigenous, the native people of that land were so-called savages, they were to be managed, they were to be controlled, they were to be civilized, that kind of language you hear quite frequently in many colonized contexts. So once the anti-apartheid movement was successful in 1994 and a post-apartheid constitution came into being, one may think, wow, here we are, we're going to move forward, we're going to become democratic, and we're going to have a path to change. But that instant change didn't come, and even almost 30 years later, it still hasn't come. And I was there last year visiting some schools and also visiting universities, and it is not changing in the way that one would have hoped once Nelson Mandela was freed and became the prime minister, the president. So Ashwani highlights several concerns to help us explain what it is that happened in South Africa, for why there wasn't a change that came about. And he talked about it already, this focus and this preoccupation with the outcomes and this idea of competency-based outcomes in the curriculum. And the idea of taking a very instrumental approach to education, which is very much linked to the idea of behavioral psychology. And then, of course, this notion of multiculturalism, the government of South Africa talked about this non-racial approach, and that may sound grand to be non-racial. It's almost like this idea of being colorblind, which is not something to be proud of or even to laud, to say, oh, I'd never noticed color. Of course you do, and to say that you don't, that is a problem. And it also, by saying I'm colorblind, you're also ignoring the differences that are very real differences in us. And it also allows us to ignore racism too. So anyway, the biggest taking away from that non-racial approach was that it really does ignore the subjectivities in South Africa, which are raced, they are gendered, and they are classed, and more. So additionally, the persistence of dysfunctional schools, of poverty, of poor infrastructure, the lack of trained teachers, the prevalence of the hegemony of English and Afrikaans, they have resulted in barriers to education and societal transformation. So it's a complex gathering of challenges. Malnourishment was another one that came up. It's very hard to learn when you're hungry. So that residue of that old oppressive regime, it's still alive and well. It continues in its full strength in South Africa. And when I went to Cape Town, I was invited to come to one of the campuses, and I was stunned how entirely the campus was black. And I thought that all universities had opened their doors to all of the so-called four groups, which they called Indian, colored, white, and black. And so I was surprised that there's still this what appears to be a segregated system in the universities and in the schools. And so while they do have such an open policy in theory, there's still a reluctance to move. I've talked to professors who said, well, I'm not going to move over to that university. They have poor infrastructure. You know, I'm pretty happy where I am. So it still predominantly white folks are staying in their universities and the black folks are staying in their own. And of course, this idea that we have 11 national languages in South Africa, and the difficulties in trying to find sufficient materials for teaching those 11 languages is a challenge. So curriculum materials have still not been developed in all of those 11 national languages. And so there is the hegemony then again of the dominant language. So also when I was there most recently, last year, I went to Cape Flats. I don't know if you're familiar with the Cape Flats in Cape Town. It's an area where the so-called colored group were all sort of put, kind of like what we have done to the First Nations peoples here. And it's really quite a dismal context. There's rival gangs, there's murders, drug dealing, that they've brought the military in. We had an escort to come in with an drug dealer. He got us through, but the whole time we were there, it was tension. You could hear bullets flying. And we went into a school. There were children that were excited to see us and were like joyous and telling us their dreams. They wanted to be doctors and engineers and architects and teachers. And they were hopeful. They had their dreams. But of course, they were also traumatized. They were suffering from PTSD. The violence had increased 60% in the last 10 years. And for them, there was no way out. There's no way out of the Cape Flats. The gangs have controls of the various areas of the Cape Flats. So, you know, even though the community came together and built a swimming pool, they had a library, they had a school, they had playgrounds, those each were controlled by the gangs from which so-called owned those areas. So they had full control. They commandeered them, basically. So there was lots of avenging of death. In fact, the day that we went, a teacher had just been shot and killed. And the children are dealing with that on a regular basis. So the military came in and they're trying to do what they can. The police go in, the police get killed. It's really such a devastating context. It's heartbreaking. And I feel that that is a reminder for us that education, I mean, we are entrusted as educators, we are entrusted with tremendous faith and trust by communities that we're going to do our best for societies. We're going to do our best to see transformation for peace and get away from conflict. And it is a reminder that we are considered dangerous, us as educators. In repressive regimes, in revolution, some of the first folks to go, to be imprisoned, to be killed, are teachers, our educators, our professors, the intelligentsia. So that speaks to the power that we potentially have. And I also think it's a reminder that our work is a matter of life and death, even though we may feel comfort and, we're moving about quite peacefully in our own context. It is a matter of peace and war, education is, and it's a matter of freedom of oppression. And I would say it's important for us to consider ourselves in solidarity with folks around the world. We are in relation with our fellow educators around the world. We need to see ourselves in relation across borders, across cultures, across these socially constructed differences. And it brings us back to the notion of I am because we are, which is an African, the Ubuntu tradition. So really, I guess the essence of what I'm trying to say is that our work is not simple work. And I think the strength of Ashwani's book is that it does try to highlight the complexity of what our work is, that our work is cut out for us as educators, and his invitation to different perspectives, different insights. It really is inviting us to remember the different ways of us to understand what's going on in the world, what's going on in cultures, what's going on in societies. And it also puts me in mind of the Sankofa. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Sankofa bird. It's a symbol of a bird holding an egg in its beak, and it's turning backwards, looking back. And it's a reminder that we have to look back in order for us to move forward. And I think that's something that Ashwani is pointing out, is the wisdoms and the philosophies, our ways of knowing and being, have been denied in some ways. Our ways of teaching, our ways of learning. As you were saying early on, Ashwani, it's almost like we have structured education as this sort of monolithic thing that we can't really get away from. But if we look back at our ancestors, if we recognize that we're standing on the shoulders of our ancestors, we are here because of what they were able to do. I look at my own ancestors and see not only have they survived slavery, they have survived colonialism and oppressions of all sorts. But we're still standing. We're still here. We still survive. We still have a message. We still have wisdom. We still have ways of knowing and being that's going to continue to challenge this structure that we've somehow come to accept as the normal way of being as teachers and educators. So, yeah, I'm going to leave it at that. I'm going to say that we need to look at the resistance movements and the revolutionary movements that have allowed us to persevere. And I think that could be an additional strength to highlight. So thank you again for your book and for inviting me.
Took a course with Ashwani sometime, or I guess a couple courses with you sometime back, and I really appreciated his work. I teach various humanities courses, different English, high school level English courses, and my baby is Black History 11. I live out in Eastern Shore as well too, and just a short walk from my house. You're talking about apartheid in South Africa, and I was there last year, but I wasn't a very good student. I only went to one school to check it out, and I was more interested in the white sharks and the black-white relations, I have to admit. So I don't have anything to connect with there, but where I live, right here in our own neck of the woods, if I walk up the road, I get to, I live in Lake Echo, I get to Walker Bell Street. And a little bit east of that street, almost everybody is white, right? I don't know the number. I don't know if it's 95% or 98% or 99%, but almost everybody is white for whatever that means. And on the other side of the street, we have East Preston, and I don't know what the numbers are either. I don't know if it's 90% or 98% or 82%, but almost, well, a very large percentage of East Preston is black. So that one street that I walk up and down regularly, if I go on this side, I have a massive black community, and if I go on this side, I have a massive white community, and they're separated by a street that's much less narrow than this room. So we've got a ways to go still, even locally, right? But I don't know what that means, but I was just thinking of that while we were listening to that wonderful talk. Neoliberalism has taken on I guess I'm here partly just because I'm interested in Krishnamurti, but also I've been teaching here for, I guess, this is year 16 now. So I've watched sort of this neoliberalism, for lack of a better word, expand its role in my professional life dramatically, I would say over the last 5 to 8 years or so. So I want to sort of share with you a little bit about what that means in my role as a public educator, and some of the constraints that are connected with it, give you a few anecdotes, and also try and connect it up with Krishnamurti and Ashwani's book that I enjoyed very much. You just mentioned teachers historically are sometimes shot when regime changes occur because teachers are seen as dangerous. Supposedly educators are helping people question things, question themselves, their society, systems, technologies, what have you. And that propensity to help people question or to incite questioning can be dangerous for the status quo. So I hope that's still true. I hope they're going to come for me. But I guess I would wonder, I would question, here and now, is it true that teachers in general, culturally, right, if there is such a thing as a culture of educators here in Halifax or Nova Scotia or Canada or the Western world or however you want to define it, is there a culture where educators are a threat to whatever the status quo is? Is there a sense that were teachers to become more unified, and again, whatever definition you choose, maybe it includes professors, maybe it includes administration, I have no idea, but I guess I hope that's still the case. I hope that teachers are still a threat conceptually to the status quo, because that's certainly part of our role. But I wonder what effect neoliberalism has had on educators' courage to do so. Just questioning. It's like this wonderful opportunity to actually think about what was going on psychologically with myself, right? And hopefully it doesn't delve into an exercise in narcissism of some sort, but just sit there and ask yourself, what's going on, right? And I really think at some level that's one of the great things about Krishnamurti, to the extent that I understand him, and I think he's very difficult to understand. I speak for myself, very hard for me to understand him, but and I often will find myself realizing, oh, this was not quite their tricks, right? But please.
Krishnamurti is the philosopher we will be studying in the next class.
Oh. One of the interesting things about Krishnamurti is that, I think he sort of implicitly encourages you to watch what's going on with yourself as honestly as you can, and to ask yourself, what's really happening internally, right? So I left my job at 3:30. I'm required to be there till 3:30. Check mark, no problem, right? I drove here as quickly as I could without endangering lives. Check mark. There was a limit to what I could do to mitigate the circumstances, and yet the automatic reaction in our society, or maybe it's just me, is you start to internalize it and take it personally, beat yourself up, get very stressed out, right? I can't affect the traffic. Right? I can't change what time I have to be at work. I mean, it's excuses, but at the end of the day, we're trained, I think, in our society, which is, I think you'd agree, quite a judgmental one, to pick ourselves apart on a regular basis in ways when, first off, it may not be fruitful to any extent. It usually isn't. And second of all, it may not even be realistic. It may become a very personal thing that actually has nothing to do with you, right? At some level, I should probably have told Ashwani that I would be here at 5 o'clock or by 5 o'clock. But this is the kind of sort of self-awareness that can easily become a cliche, or someone can engrave it on a piece of wood and sell it at Pier 1 or Pier 21, whichever is not the Immigration Museum. Excuse me, I'm at the front of the room. But you can easily, all of these sort of buzzwords or cliches can come out of studying some mindfulness or self-awareness, or whatever you want to call it. But as soon as you start sort of labeling it, it becomes something to chase, right? And it becomes almost a goal, right? anyway, it starts falling in on itself. I'm not going to get too much into Krishnamurti here at this stage of the game. Apparently, this is next week's talk.
I think now I'm remembering they have studied somewhat, right? Yeah.
I imagine you. I mean, you can't keep something that good to yourself, right?
Yeah.
Page 199 of the book. Let's. I want to talk about things at a more concrete level for a few moments. Traditional social studies imply an instrumental, transmissive, passive approach to social studies, teaching, and learning. You know, it's a cliche now, but that sort of transmission model where you're sort of pouring information and facts into your students who are, you know, the vessels and what kind of thing. We know that's not good teaching now, right? We know that in social studies and the humanities and English language arts or what have you, there are all kinds of wonderful interactive dialogical ways of approaching methodologies that are not just here are a bunch of facts, memorize them, puke them back up, and we'll grade you to the extent that you've approximated our model. But we talk about outside of the box thinking, and there's a whole industry founded on creativity. Right? All kinds of books you can find on how to be creative, how to foster creative thinking in your students. And it sounds wonderful. No one's going to suggest that creativity is well, I'm certainly not going to suggest creativity is problematic. But as a goal, as an external goal that can be measured by someone else to see how creative you are, we start getting into some difficult landscape here. In an outcome-based system, that's sort of what's required. So outcome-based system, you're looking for indicators of understanding or ability or skill set, whatever you want to call it. You're looking for indicators, which you know ahead of time, and which are the same indicators as the person teaching the course upstairs, and which will be the same next year, right? So you can know these things prior to meeting your class. Right? A lot of teachers have been trained about the problems connected with sort of a robust notion of objectivity or universality, and certainly a lot of teachers, I think, have at least some peripheral understanding of, you know, subjectivity, cultural relativism, et cetera, but, and so they've moved away, at least in words, from considering the humanities as social science, right? So we talk about ethnography, and we talk about creativity, and we talk about different voices being represented, and we talk about all of these sorts of things. But is that actually the methodology at this time? Are the methodologies of the practice of teaching such that we allow for those kinds of differences, those subjective differences? I think we've got a lot of the lingo down, but what about the actual structures? Are the structures matching the official truths and the buzzwords? I just noticed there's a video camera, so I'll have to print some resumes tomorrow. 16 years, not bad.
No. We will edit it.
Good.
Yeah.
The goal of postmodern social studies education is a phrase on page 203. Should be to examine, understand, and reveal the deeper meaning, structures, and processes that underpin social history. It was one of the quotes, I believe you used this quote in your talk, stood out for me as well. The goal of postmodern anything is an interesting idea, right? So my own background before I somehow ended up as a teacher was in philosophy, and I'm an ideas person. I really like ideas. I did before you ruined my love of ideas. But we found other ways to sort of stock wisdom. But postmodernism was always something that was quite interesting to me, not as a word or not as a branch per se, but I ended up sort of reading a lot of what people you'd call postmodernists, whether it was Nietzsche or whoever it was, and Foucault. And so, is postmodernism post-moral, or is there is there a new sort of possibility for morality past modernity? And what is this modernity, right? And were the sort of existentialist thinkers or the posties really, were they post-morality in general, or was it something more along the lines of this very sort of possibly naive, robust, objective, universal, scientific vision, right? I mean, it coincides with attacks against certain systemic religion at the same time historically, right? Not a coincidence. Not a coincidence that the people who are considered postmodernists are often seen in other sections of their work, or even the same, attacking different structures that are considered sacred. And so I guess I'm intrigued by this idea of a postmodern ideal. And I don't know anything. I don't know whether. I guess I think it needs further discussion. I think it's quite an interesting idea, because is there a new sort of ideal that can be articulated after modernity, or is it actually beyond that whole objective ideal? Is it lumped in with what it was aiming to get past? So is postmodernism post-morality? I don't know. I'm a little concerned that this delves into concepts a bit, so I don't want to spend too much time on it, just in the sense that it's a little theoretical, right? Too theoretical. Yeah. Philosopher. Neoliberalism is supposed to be, at some level, it's supposed to be beyond some of the institutions and traditions that were found to be problematic for all people, I suppose, depending on how you want to define it. And so to get rid of all of those sort of biased, the free market is portrayed. I mean, just look at the language, right? Free market, it's open, it's unencumbered, there's no hindrances, it's not muddied by us getting our fingers on it. It's free, it's open, it's not dictated by us, right? But is a free market actually free in any extent? As if who it serves is random or neutral, right? The free market obviously obviously serves the status quo. Whoever has the most power has the means to protect it, by definition. So a free market economy, whether you're for it or not, I'm not going to argue about it too much. I'm sure my biases are quite clear there. But this idea of a free market being value neutral, as Ashwani indicated, is absolutely absurd. It serves one sector of society very much so at the expense of others. And so when this trickles down into education, and it's billed as neutral and unbiased and sort of human nature, we have this Darwinist sort of slant to it, right? This human beings are naturally competitive. Let's stop with all of the nonsense ideas that we, concocted, and let's get down to the truth, the scientific truth. We're animals, we're competitive, we've been hunters for all of these years, we kill, we compete, the survival of the fittest, all of these sorts of things. And so, and it's brought up as this sort of, as this very plain, vanilla, shared, universal blanket. And the problem is that it serves one group very clearly at the expense of others, right? And it's not a logic that requires any serious thought to realize, right? If you are financially powerful in a free market, you're going to do what needs to be done to maintain that power, and you'll have the ability, because it's a free market and you're the powerful. I mean, it's not rocket science, right? When it trickles down into education, when that ideal of the free market trickles into education, and you see the relationship with the status quo, hegemony, authority, who dictates what counts as wisdom, good education, quality indicators of learning, quality indicators of teaching. It's a little sinister, right? Have I been shut off? I knew this would happen. If we go back to why there was education in Europe a few hundred years ago, or what have you, and again, very Eurocentric perspective, but that's where our education system here comes from primarily. It's a factory model, as we know. You can tie in agrarian history. You can tie in harvest time with summer break. If you ask most kids, how come they have summers off? They don't know. You ask most parents, they don't know. Teachers, because we work so hard. But it comes from a tradition of the kids had to go back to the farm and help harvest, as many of us know. So they weren't able to go to school at that time. Excuse my awkwardness, it's well honed. They couldn't go to school because they had to help their families harvest. And so we've just maintained that. None of us know why. None of us are asking why. And I'm not arguing against traditions. There's lovely traditions, but we should probably pick and choose which ones we keep based on how we feel or think or what have you. But we're still using this factory model based on competition and sort of providing workers to society in order for it to function properly, right? So again, I would just like to ask which traditions and think a bit more critically about it. Ashwani wrote on 257 that meditative revolution of the inner consciousness is a precondition to the transformation in outer structures. I didn't write a lot, but one of the things I wrote in here was that it's sort of a way of addressing interpersonal relations, I think, through the intrapersonal. In other words, if I have a problem with Ashwani, I'm in deep trouble. But if I have a problem with Ashwani, instead of us working through the problem between us, we might do that. And I'm not suggesting Krishnamurti would say, no, don't do that. But I might look at what's going on within my own self to see what's happening, right? To actually try and honestly, I guess, again, and you know, I know you're not studying Krishnamurti per se, all of you, or what have you, but you know, Freud, I guess Sigmund Freud wanted us to look at our unconsciouses and subconscious selves and see what's hidden from us. This is not that, right? But it's, I think there is this latent notion that we can fool ourselves if we're not sufficiently attentive. And I know for my own self and my own practice, since I've been reading and thinking about some of these, I mean, I don't even know what to call it in their own topics, but I've found it harder to fool myself as often. So I still do it, and I still catch myself doing it often. But it's harder for me to hide my motivations to myself after reading some of this man's work and seeing some videos and classes and what have you. And it's not even like a purely psychological process, right? It's not, oh, I'm this selfish or jealous, right? It's not even that. It's just sort of being a little bit more, instead of just doing what happens, you're doing what happens, but instead of judging it and instead of quantifying it or evaluating it, you're just trying to pay a bit more attention to what you're up to, right? And that's I think, a fair depiction of some of what might come from reading Krishnamurti. But again, it's this idea that instead of going out and fixing the world, instead of fighting for change externally, looking at, here's a problem. We tend to be warmongers, for example, as human beings, some of us. And so now how am I a warmonger, right? I've never right? So, and you start going down that, but then if you go a little deeper, what do I do that is the same psychological process that may be warlike or aggressive? Where are my aggressive tendencies? Where's my aggressive thinking? Where's my, you know, and you can start to see similarities, right? Maybe it's a matter of degree, but you can see that at some level, you know, I'm responsible for this war at some level, because the same kind of psychology that causes this problem is in me too. And if I still have it, why am I going to go fix her or fix him? But even there, right, I'm catching myself, because now it becomes something to fix, and now there's a goal, and now there's something you're chasing, and now there's anyway. That sounds like my cue. Okay, a couple more. Do I have 2 minutes, or are we done? Sure, or do I? Corporations have been defined in some states, countries, and what have you, as persons literally, right? Think about that for a second. Relationships between economic entities have humanhood, have personhood, right? So you look at the history of personhood in Canada or in North America or where have you, and there have been persons who were not granted personhood. Many, many of them, lots, more than half, right? And but now we have companies that are persons and entitled to certain dignities and what have you, right? and no individual entity aside from how many, I mean, how many individual people or families have the kind of dollars to compete with those corporations? Very few. And so what becomes powerful is not even a certain small segment of human beings. It's not even them. It's the relationship between that small segment of human beings. And now it's more powerful than any one of them. Yeah, that's it. No, it's not. One more last thing. Neoliberalism as an ideal struck me as interesting. Is neoliberalism an ideal, or does it come about postmodernism as some sort of reaction to a lack of? Are we still looking for some sort of universality that some of us don't believe exists, and are we replacing it with something else that sort of feels like it, but maybe passes the mustard conceptually? The other day, I teach grade 11 academic English, and the other academic English teacher for grade 11 wants to teach Romeo and Juliet, which is great. She's very passionate about Shakespeare, and she does a fine job getting kids who wouldn't otherwise get into Shakespeare to get into Shakespeare. Not all of them, but most of them. It's good. I can't do that with Shakespeare. I like Shakespeare. I've read some Shakespeare, but I don't personally feel like it's the best use of my students' time. So I have to figure out another play, another historical iconic play or something to do at the same time. No problem. So I decided I'm going to do iconic play Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett. Some of you may love it, some of you may have read it, some of you may never have heard of this man. No judgment. But, you know, it's an iconic play. I had to do a bias evaluation on Waiting for Godot to show that it wasn't a biased play. So it's a canon of English literature. That requires, I mean, I would suggest there's more bias in Romeo and Juliet than even this play. But the point is, if you do anything that's even perceived to be outside of the box, which this isn't, the way I do it hopefully will be, but you know, Waiting for Godot is not edgy. Choosing that play is not edgy. But I have to do a bias check. What's that mean? Oh, you have to prove that it's not biased. Well, it is biased. Me choosing this is completely and utterly biased. You think it's a coincidence that the guy with the philosophy background chose Waiting for Godot to do an English class, right? There's all kinds of values that this decision are laden with, and it is a biased text. It talks about things. I mean, one of the implicit messages is, you know, transcend the material world, perhaps. Well, that's very biased. I happen to agree with it, but it's biased, right? What if I'm teaching Black history? One of my biases is that I'm not a big fan of racism. Should I fill out a... Anyway, that's all for today.
Thank you so much, everybody. I just want to thank you for your careful reading of the book, and I think all of the ideas that you shared were so good. And so rich that I can't even summarize them now. So much information that I want to think about and understand a little bit more. But I think we should open it for question and answer. Is that good? So I will be moderating the session and answering the question too, if they are meant for me. So please ask your questions or make comments.
I can speak loud. Okay. Oh, thank you. I think the reform. I think it's beautiful. I'm going to buy the book, but I spent 6 months in Mexico teaching English in the university as a volunteer, and the culture there is completely different than what it is here. So the microcosm there. Like I had an experience, I want to change something in the writing, and I was told this is not part of the curriculum. So I had a problem. So I explained to the director of the department. He said, no, you don't change that because we don't teach writing. We teach reading and speaking. I said, why not? Well, there's little sections of blog that they can write in one paragraph. And I said, that's not fair. I came all the way from Canada as a volunteer. This is my 4th time here, and I cannot teach my students advanced class writing, proper writing, not I went to the market or something, a theme like loneliness, something that they can express themselves. So they didn't like that. So I didn't do it. So what I'm saying is, here, we are talking about neoliberalism and so on. Can we apply this to countries that are a little bit below the level that we are in intellectual? And they say, don't shake the water. We are comfortable here. That's my problem. I was there.
Well, I think that is because of neoliberalism, because neoliberalism is very prominent around the world, but definitely in Mexico and Brazil, it is becoming more and more prominent, especially in Mexico. All these notions of outcomes, standardization, sticking to what is the scripted curricula, and all these notions of efficiency and all that, I think this is very prominent in Mexico. I'm not sure why your director was not asking you to do that, but that is also one manifestation of being limited by the curriculum, the prescribed curriculum, rather than what teacher wants to do and what students might want to learn.
I think I discovered after, in my own thoughts, that all the teachers there, they are native Mexicans. They study in Mexico and so on. None of them that was like native from Canada or United States. So the fear of correcting the papers, I think that was one of the problems why they eliminate the composition completely. Mm-hmm. How they can correct the paper if you don't know the proper, how to make a good topic alive. Mm-hmm. So I think that's my own understanding. So, but I enjoyed the class. I gave them the best I could do, and they enjoyed my teaching and the excitement. I was there for the 4th time, and so it's but something. The other thing which I found, every uniform, every university, every school, high school, elementary, had a uniform, mm-hmm. which makes everybody equal. That's so. Thank you.
Thank you.
This one works. So there's something I want to touch on. The last speaker had a comment on the personhood of corporations. From my understanding, although I'm not a lawyer, it's kind of considered a legal fiction. So, for example, in the case of history, in maritime law, ships also used to be considered persons too, because if you caught a slave ship, the owner of the slave ship could say, well, I'd had no idea about this cargo. It wasn't mine. It must have been the ship captain. And the ship captain themselves could say, oh, well, the owner put it on. It's not even my ship. So really the responsibility went to him. The courts came up with the legal fiction which said the ship itself was a person, and thus it could be decommissioned as punishment, or it itself could be treated as the plaintiff. So that was a way of punishing the owner and anyone who actually needed the ship. In terms of corporations and how they could have free speech rights, as an example of why that might be important, consider, for example, if Donald Trump didn't like a certain piece on CNN because it implicated that on the latest Ukrainian affair, for example, and he said as his defense, well, I'm not actually punishing the person who wrote the article, I'm punishing CNN. CNN isn't a person, and thus they don't really get free speech rights. Whether or not free speech also then transcends into money, that's very debatable. So I won't touch on that. But in terms of the book, I just wanted to ask, in terms of how education is done now, it's very specialized. So when you go to university or a trade school, the idea is you're there for one thing and one thing only, and once you learn that, you really don't need anything else. Whereas the classical form of education, everyone used to be a generalist, more or less. So going back into history, the Apostle Paul, he not only was very learned in works of Greek philosophy and theology, but he also was a tent maker, for example. would that specialization also be one of neoliberalism's more negative consequences as well?
Well, I think I would say so because it's more about employability. So, education is being looked at as an instrument to gain employment. Now, there is no problem with that. Once you are getting education, you should also be able to earn your livelihood. But then that becomes so instrumental, then everybody is focused. See, in many countries, in many developed countries, US, Canada, and some countries in Europe too, students have to pay for their education. So uh, we are kind of creating a self-centered notion of education. You pay for your education and then you work for yourself, and that is the entire purpose of education. So it's a very instrumental, limited kind of a purpose of an education that we have conditioned ourselves and everybody with. And it will become worse and worse. In fact, what happens is when somebody comes to your class, they think that they are paying for it. And if they are paying for it, they want to get exactly what they want from you. And but the problem is that that's not how education should work. Education is should be first of all based on freedom of exploration, and second of all its purpose should be overall development, not necessarily as a commodity of buying and selling what you are interested in. So I think that's very true. Even in B.Ed you will see people become very deeply interested in their own subject areas. So no problem with deeply exploring your subject area, but whenever you will deeply explore something, you will start to find connection. You will begin to see that history is not isolated from geography, and geography is not isolated from politics, and so are other subjects. They are deeply interconnected. So the one problem is that we may become too specific and then begin to, and stop seeing the greater connection among the subjects. And we may also see education in a, see, that's what happens when certification or education is provincially regulated. Like, you are not getting a certificate to become an educator, but it's a certificate to teach in a particular context. Then you begin thinking only in terms of that context. So that specialization is also very limiting, and that's harmful. You should develop as an educator who can teach in any context. You go into the context, you learn about the context, and you teach in the context. But if you are only educating yourself keeping in mind one particular context, you're limiting your horizons. Does that respond? Anybody would else like to respond to that question? Susie, Amelie, Hart.
I think it's also about efficiency. If you can just package things, it's so much easier than if you actually have to think about what you're offering. So I'd say it's about efficiency and commodification.
Very true.
I'd add a point. I think we're very lucky in Canada, and I'm going to say this because if I look at my peers who graduated from their PhD in the past, say, couple of years, my 10 years of education at an Ivy school in Canada was less than 1 year of scholarity in the States. So I think, we're not in a perfect state in education, but if we compare, it's not that bad, Okay, that's all I'll say.
So awkward. I think it's part of the fragmentation that, again, serves to maintain whatever happens to be the status quo. And I'm not suggesting anyone's behind the curtain making it do that on purpose, but to the extent that we're talking about different topics, to the extent that we're fragmented intellectually, discursively, in terms of our careers, our practices, what we're interested in, whatever, to the extent that we're fragmented, we're disunified. To the extent that we're disunified, power structures remain safe.
Hi, my question is mostly concerning Hart. I think your conversation on like the bias check or whatever, but I think it could go for anybody. I'm entering like kind of the teaching profession as someone who definitely doesn't think that teaching and education is politically neutral. I would say that I explicitly have challenging the status quo as a goal of mine, but I'm afraid of how I'm going to go about that. So I was just wondering if any of you have any advice, kind of like navigating teaching and working as an educator when you are kind of pushing up against the dominant narrative and paradigm. Just a piece of advice if you have any. Thank you.
I can take that if you like to begin. I feel like there is a curriculum and it's sanctioned by government, but I feel there are places of light where you can move. And I had taught in the Middle East, and I remember the first day on the job, we went through American curriculum for some reason and had to white out any mention of bacon or ham and any illustration of pigs or girls in ballet costumes. So I mean, that took probably 2 days of white out, which didn't make any sense in the end because it was like Johnny buys a sandwich, and and it just didn't even read well with the bits that were missing. So I brought in, maybe I shouldn't admit it, but I brought in the thing called Charlotte's Web and talked about the pig, and just the pig is a wonderful creature, and it had a life, it had a story, it had a narrative, and I think it just opened up possibilities. I mean, I know that's just like a small little example, but I feel like in all the countries that I've taught in, there are ways to navigate and get at the challenging of the status quo, because I do feel it is our job, it is our responsibility as educators, is not to toe the party line. It's something that we need to have courage to do and subvert at times. So.
Okay. Hi, Shannon. I think that's a great question. I always go back to Parker Palmer. We teach who we are, right? I think, and we are not perfect selves, and so expecting that kind of status quo of ourselves is not really realistic. But going back to the conversation about compartmentalizing, sorry, I'm using my best English. I think we do that in ourselves because we make sense of partialities on the daily, right? Curriculum's organized that way. And so one of the things that I find where posthumanism, postmodernism is useful is because us as women, we've been objectified for so long. And as educators, it's important, especially in academia, to think beyond that and to think about the relational and to kind of decenter ourselves and be aware of our environment. So, yeah, if that makes sense.
Got it. You're a public school teacher. What? Yeah. So I guess I would just say that the positive and negative is that it's legitimately dangerous. So you'll probably pay for it several times, and it's well worth it. You'll be fine.
Well, I think Susie also said in her talk about education as resistance, and then she reiterated that first of all, we have to realize that as educators, it is our responsibility not just to be the installers of curriculum, not to be passive agents. Somebody told us what to do, and we do exactly that. First of all, that the realizing that is very important. That am I a passive agent? Passive and agent don't go together. Am I a passive entity, or what is my goal as an educator now? But that may become idealistic and utopic, because when you will go into the context as you are afraid, and as I was afraid when I was a teacher in India, that context, all the contexts have their own limitations, because the dominant power structures, the dominant mentalities in India, it's exam centered system. So those restrictions, mentalities are everywhere. So first of all, you also have to understand your restrictions and limitations and study the context a little bit. A lot of the time when we are discussing in class, students immediately say, okay, what can we do? And I say, don't worry about doing first. Let's worry about understanding first. Understand your context, understand your students, understand your principal, understand your colleagues. And there is always room. People found room in Nazi regimes. People found room in apartheid kind of regimes. So you will find room. There are rooms. It's that people may be too afraid. People may be too scared. But if you know your purpose and if you study your context, I think you will find a way to do it. And you don't have to necessarily go in the media and alert everybody, right? What kind of challenging educator you are. But so subtlety also is the thing that I want to say. Some people are more explicit, nothing wrong with that. They are activists, they are explicit political activists, but you can also bring about changes and revolution through subtle interaction, through what you say, how you relate with the student, what kinds of insights and perceptions you allow them to develop in their mind. I am a bigger fan of subtlety, that through subtlety you can also bring about a lot of change. Does that make sense?
Mine is a bass voice. Thank you very much for giving this very good opportunity for learning. And after listening and briefly listening from your presentation and other professors and other professors and other colleagues, I want to straightforward because I'm from grassroots. Now I'm sitting in the global level. What I am thinking, what my people in the grassroots level thinking. Definitely, every crisis is an opportunity. At this situation, the best opportunity, what for my small mind is getting, how can we come out from the fragile situation of the education? No place everywhere. And how can we make the education again blooming? I thought in some places of the world, whenever the farmers are not getting the proper production to their crops, they declare crop holiday. I'm thinking this is the right time. Declare holiday to all the commercial educational institutions in every part of this globe and go back, revive, find the seeds where we lost and get back. The big problem talking about this neoliberalism, yes, definitely. Once the government forgetting about their service role to commercial role, constructing of the airports, power plants, and all these things, naturally, the corporate coming, interfering into the governance, the beauty of the neoliberalism. And unfortunately, the community social responsibility. In the last 10 years, if you see these terminologies, sometimes it is very, very difficult to digest. So I feel very strongly in a democratic situation like in the world, in many parts of the world, what is the community social responsibility instead of the corporate social responsibility? They are interfering into the governance matters, and these fellows are looking into how to make this education, health, everything commercialized. Very, very lucky. At least they are not looking into the mother's milk to commercialize in this globalized society in the nearer future. So I'm very, very happy to learn from your long experiences and other professors and other teachers. I want to see this book must be a beautiful voice, and this voice must be transformed into the real users who required this thing. Otherwise, there are so many books in the libraries. I don't want to see this book as a voice before the washer. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I think everybody knows that you can access this book for free from the Mount Library, right? Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I just wanted to congratulate you, Ashwani, and celebrate with
Thank
my
you
colleagues.
for your support.
Wonderful evening. And I also wanted to respond to Shannon. Shannon? Yes. One of the things that you talk about in the book is the education in Singapore, which I find quite interesting because when you look at Singapore and the success that it's had, it rates highest in the PISA scores, considered to produce the most intellectual students, the highest ability students, and so on. But as you describe it, it has there's a very tight connection between the government and the prescribed curriculum, very little freedom with the teacher to be able to teach what they want to teach within that. But it's effective. And I think that many jurisdictions around the world look at that as a model for if government interferes, we can improve education. And I think that's certainly something we're seeing in this province, and we're seeing it within the BEd as well. We are in a situation where the government is going through in a process of accrediting BEd programs around this province, and in some ways describing what we're going to teach, and I think in some ways even moving into how we're going to teach it, which impinges on some of the academic freedom of our faculty. So I'm delighted that we're having this conversation. We obviously have to move in that direction. We have to train our teachers for Nova Scotia schools and schools for the world, hopefully. And we've also moved, as well as a neoliberal agenda, perhaps technocratic agenda, we've issued our students, our BEd students and most of our graduate students with Chromebooks provided by Nelson. So we're partnering with, a corporate identity, and they've called their project Edwin to even sound like a person, although it's of course education winning. And my hope and aspirations around that is that the students will look at those, but from a very critical perspective about what can we do with this? How can we bring the creativity? What does it mean in the classroom? Rather than just naturally accepting, what that technology is. And Amelie, I know the work that you're doing there in technology education, and what you've talked about today will be doing that. So it gives us a ray of hope. And I think for Shannon, Ashwani's response was absolutely spot on in terms of there are opportunities within the system to change. I think if you go into schools thinking that you're just going to push the curriculum aside and not teach it, you're likely to be fired. But there are opportunities, there are good opportunities, and I hope you have that faith to think that way. Thank you. Thank you.
I just want to thank you for your comment, because I think it is very important for us to realize what's happening and not turn a blind eye to it. We should know what's going on, because unless you know your situation completely, it's very difficult to respond to it properly. So, and the problem is we can't create an alternate reality. We are in this reality, so the more we understand it, the better we have the chances to change it, then try to find an alternate reality, because that doesn't exist.
Yeah, thank you.
I also had a different book symposium before the book was published. Med was one of the symposium panelists, and Bonnie, who is so kindly recording the video, and there were two other students who are not here. So Med has also read the book very carefully, and I really enjoyed reading his comments.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, first, congratulations. And I had the pleasure to read your book, and it's really interesting. As I was reading it, I could not help but just relate it to the context where I came from, Morocco, education there. So, as you probably know, Morocco was colonized by France last century, and where colonization left the language French had a greater status in Morocco. The power elite in Morocco, they speak French, they send their children to French schools, so
Same in India. English
Yeah.
became the symbol of power.
So right, yeah. So I was thinking about the influence of ideology, colonialism, and the responses, the indigenous response. So now there is a heated debate in Morocco around language of instruction in high schools. So there is this proposal: the government is going to make French, as a language of instruction, especially in science subjects like natural science and physics and math. And there is the conservative party in Morocco, which is basically the Islamists there. They are just opposing this, saying that this is the language of the colonialists. And there is also, in the same time, this debate also about the language of instruction in the elementary school with elementary students. So there are intellectuals who are suggesting that the language of instruction for primary students should be their mother tongue. And again, the Islamists who oppose the use of French in high school, they're opposing the use. Well, when you hear that the Conservative Party is opposing the use of French as a language of instruction in high school, you think this is an indigenous response kind of thing to, kind of oppose this colonial power of just putting their language in instruction. But then the same Islamist party that opposes this, they oppose the use of mother tongue in the instruction of primary students. And as I've read in your book, in the experience of Mexico, I think, and South Africa, one of the first things they did is they tried to incorporate the local language, indigenous languages, as language of instruction. And you actually mentioned that some of the linguists or research done in this area actually support the use of mother tongue in the instruction of especially primary students. So here in Morocco, we have this kind of we have ideology, a religious ideology of people who think that we need to teach students using classical Arabic, even though nobody speaks classical Arabic outside the classroom. And then there is also this colonial power that French is the language of instruction. So I want your take on this and what do you think about it? I mean, indigenizing education through giving language a special status. So what would you say about that? Or in other words, the importance of language in the indigenous process. Thank you.
It's a very difficult question. I'll try to respond to it, but would anybody like to go first? Oh, but this is difficult. Sorry?
Great question.
Well, I'll try to say few things and see if they make sense. Number one, I think mother tongue is very, very important, and it has happened in a lot of countries when colonizers left the country. Because their identity, their culture, their language was the symbol of power. Those things will become symbol of powers even for the indigenous people. By indigenous people, mean local people. Like when British left India, English, their way of thinking, their way of living, their way of clothing. Actually, clothing is worldwide now, Western. But all those things became important. So one thing, absolutely, mother tongue is really, really important, or your first language is really, really important, because that's what you understand, not just cognitively, but with your whole being. Language is not just cognitive words, it's also a lot of emotional response to it, right? Contextual response to it. So if the instruction or if the teaching and learning is happening in the language that you are familiar with, I learned English through Hindi. When I went to school up to grade 12, I studied in a Hindi language school. Nobody spoke English in my family. Nobody spoke English in my colony. We call in India colony, although it's location or neighborhood here, right? From the colonial past, neighborhoods are called colonies in India. So, so I learned it. So English used to be one subject from grade 6 onward. So I learned English with the help of my understanding of Hindi. Through that I understood, but after a while I just lost track and it only became English. Now I don't think in terms of Hindi or translating Hindi into English. Both the languages are proficient. I'm proficient in both the languages, familiar with both the languages. But if I had been told, no, you can't use Hindi at all, then it would be so difficult for me, because I don't listen to English music. Sometimes I have enjoyed some music, but mostly don't, because music is so emotional. I listen to music in the language that I'm familiar with. Even in India, I don't listen to music in all languages. So language is very close to your heart, your own language. And if you suppress that, you are suppressing culture, you are suppressing your past, you are suppressing emotional response to life, you're suppressing a lot of things. So language is very, very important. I think there are two kinds of responses. One is an indigenous response. So what do I mean by indigenous response? Is a response, not necessarily ethnocentric response. So in India, there is a lot of reaction going against Western culture, uh, demonizing it, and thinking that India was a great civilization and there were no problems. This to me is ethnocentrism. When you can't look at the problem of your culture, when you can't look at the problems or the difficulties that you're not the difficulties, there are drawbacks in all cultural practices and traditions. There are also strengths. So ethnocentrism is when I don't look at critically at my culture, that I accept everything blindly. Then I have to accept sati pratha. There was a major social evil in India where women had to die with their husband. If the husband dies, they have to die necessarily. And there were child marriages and so on and so forth. So if I look at my culture in India and say grossly everything about India, every tradition is great, that to me is ethnocentrism. So in any context, one has to see if it is so when I say indigenous response, I say holistic response. That is for the well-being of that community, also for the well-being of other communities, and also for the well-being of the entire earth. And in the context of classroom, that allow good teaching and learning, that allows students to grow holistically, learn holistically, don't have shame about their language, but at the same time are not forced to learn certain languages that those don't come naturally to me. So does it make sense? Ethnocentric response is problematic, and the world will get more and more divided if we start responding to each other ethnocentrically, that my culture, everything I do is better than the other culture. Others would like to respond.
Absolutely. I mean, I come from a francophone family. I'm from Quebec, Montreal more specifically, and I learned, like Ashwani, English very late. I think I was 15 or 16. I did a bachelor's in translation studies. So for me, like, I'm coming from a place where one completes the other, and it's really in relation to the theories that I'm looking at as well. They're partial in their own specific ways, but I really see my work and my understanding of languages as bridges. And when I work in English, I always borrow from French, and when I work in French, I always borrow from English. And this is very important, say, in research, because the references that I use are always from both worlds, and they're very distinct worlds. Say, if we look at academia in Canada, you have the French folks who cite French folks, and you have English Canadian folks who mostly cite English Canadian folks. And what I try to do is to bridge those two worlds to the best of my ability, and then also Indigenous folks, right, in Canada who are producing amazing feminist scholarship. So for me, I see language as bridge and not as exclusion, if that makes sense. Yeah.
And I'd always just add that language is power, and there is a hegemony of the colonial language, and no matter how hard we try, somehow we get the impression that some languages are lesser than others. And I think, for example, of the African American language, it is a language, but people will say it's a dialect and the black folks don't know how to talk and they're using the wrong grammar. And it's actually a systematic language that people call Ebonics, I guess some folks used to. And so there's this shame in using your own language sometimes, right? Even my children are trying to learn French. They've gone through the whole French school system, but they still have this embarrassment or something about using French with other French people, which makes no sense because that was the whole point of putting them through French immersion, was for them to develop a love for the language. But I still feel like there is a dominant language, whether it's the colonial one or whether it's the one that was imposed, and people still hold it up with reverence and they still work toward it. And I'm hoping that, like, the Mi'kmaq language is being reclaimed, not reclaimed because it was never dead, but finding ways to stimulate it and teach it to children. So I'm quite hopeful that the Indigenous focus on language can revive it to be useful.
Last question, if anybody would like to ask a question. Please.
Hi. So I really enjoyed reading the chapters that we read of your book for this week.
Thank you.
Yeah, and in chapter 8, you discussed a couple of ways that we can counter neoliberalism in the classroom. And as a upcoming teacher and as someone who's been studying education for 2 years now, but have had this as my focus for the last 6 or so, one of your recommendations was to form an international network of teachers to develop links around the world. And in my education, I found that anytime it's not Canadian content, people say, oh, it's not relevant, it's not Canadian content. We need to learn Canadian content so that we are ready for a Canadian classroom. And I guess I just wonder, as, one small person who's going to be teaching, I don't know, a class of grade 2s in Nova Scotia, how do we create, I guess, an international link, between, from the person to person, how do we bring in the perspectives from all these different relevant and wonderful cultures? How do we bring them into, a tiny Nova Scotia classroom, I guess is what I'm wondering. What would you recommend to an upcoming educator to, I guess, bring those international links into the classroom?
Well, you folks are asking such big questions. I think the first step is your interest in itself is the passage to that goal. Because you are interested, you will find ways. But I can suggest some ways. Your classrooms are not homogeneous classrooms any longer, as far as I think. Classrooms are pretty diverse. And I'm not just saying in terms of cultural backgrounds. Even if students belong to the same background, I think there is tremendous diversity. So if there is a cultural diversity and other kinds of diversities in your classroom, you can build upon that. You can encourage students to think about things that they generally wouldn't. You can introduce them to different cultures or the aspects of the culture that you are interested in, and you can ask them to bring their cultural heritage to the class. That could be one beginning place. The other beginning place, it could be like what happened in Amazon recently, the forest fire. That is such an important issue. You can definitely bring that into your classroom and connect it to your curriculum. I think it's very easy to do that in social sciences and language arts, and I think also to some extent in science. So whatever is happening in world that is relevant and current, you can also bring into the class. You can also introduce your class to the things that you really enjoy about other cultures or other parts of the world, and help them develop connection in the local context. Because the geographical landscapes are different around the world, but there are also connections. The weather systems are different, but there are also connections. Languages, cultures are different, but there are also connections. Not a very technique-based answer, but I still tried it. Would you like to say something?
Oh, I would just add about the sensitivity of maybe spotlighting one of your students to say, come and teach us about Nigeria, or, you know, depending on what the background is. So always approaching that with care, and you as the teacher doing the hard work of making sure you understand. And then I guess related to that is recognizing that the community is a resource. And somehow there's a sense sometimes of some cultures of feeling like the school is no place for me. I, as a parent, need to stay back and only will come if the principal asks me to come. But somehow opening up your school, your classroom to welcoming a variety of folks from within the community to come in. And then, of course, I'd say travel is a great eye-opener. That's really how I opened my eyes to so many things. Was my first teaching job was in Ireland, and then the second one was in Kuwait, and then I went to the Philippines. And so every year I was doing something different and going somewhere else. And so if there's ever anything that happens in the BED program that offers the opportunity to go abroad, then you really should grab it. I interviewed quite a few students who went from the St. FX BED program to Kenya, and the experience was profound. Some of these folks had never been on a plane, living in rural Nova Scotia. And so I interviewed them 5 years later to see what did it still have an impact, and it still had an impact on them, having gone to Kenya 5 years previous, and how they brought Afrocentricity into the classroom, and how they included a lot of African cultures, which they wouldn't have done previously. So those are my recommendations.
Hello again. If you think back to when you were 2 or 3 or 4, or, you know, as far back as you can remember when you were really young, let's hear from you. How would you have characterized yourself when you were 2 or 3 or 4 years old? Like, what? Give me a word, a trait. Stubborn?
Slout, I was born during the Second World War, the beginning. It was civil war in Greece, so I grew up war baby. And I end up slowly getting to Canada, and after that, but memories are still there. I learn about how to survive, how to use the land of my father so we can have food at the table, how to appreciate health and family. All these elements that became part of my life all along.
So how would you have described yourself when you were really young? Like a trait, a personality trait, or a characteristic, or an adjective?
Basically, as a florist, I used to like to grow flowers because I could sell them.
Prodigious florist.
Yes, I could sell them.
Okay. Blurt out words. Give me a word. What were you like when you were 3? Creative. Interesting. Good. What else we got? Others? Creative is great. What else? Disruptive. Good. Others? Curious. How many people weren't curious when they were kids? None of us. So education's natural, right? We know this. We don't think about it, right? We think naturally school is an imposition. Wow, I thought I had all the awkward stuff out of the way. School's an imposition, it's a jail, I'm a warden, blah, 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 right? They have to be there, they don't like it, it's boring, it's about us, it's not about them. All this stuff, right? It's forced, and it's an adult imposition onto younger people whose values are different. I don't think it's true. We are naturally curious animals, right? We were all curious when we were little kids and interested in learning about things that were relevant to us at the time. So what's ruining, like, why do I have a bunch of kids come into my room for, you know, the first time already hating the course? I haven't even told them my name, right? What's happened? What's gotten in the way? What's blocked off our curiosity? And if we can figure out how to unblock some of that curiosity, maybe differences between communities, cultures, languages, perspectives, values, maybe that naturally flows between us through dialogue and discussion and learning from each other because we're curious, not because it's an ideal.
just to conclude, this is like a really important point. We have made learning into a problem. I try to emphasize that in my classes. We have made learning into a struggle. We have to be this, we have to be that, we have to persuade students to learn, we have to find tricks and create big bags of tricks so that they can finally get into our trap and learn. But learning is natural. Everybody wants to learn. If I give you an option that if you want to learn something, learn. And there is no expectation, there is no restriction, just learn because you love it. Everybody wants to learn. Because it is prescribed, everybody wants to hate it. That's the short answer. I would like to thank everybody for being here, and I really appreciate your support. And I hope I will talk to you next week and find out your reactions of the event. But if anybody would like to say anything concluding, would you like to say something, Anthony, or anybody?
Just on behalf of everyone here, thank you so much. Wonderful evening.
Thank you.